Magandang umaga sa buong mundo. Ang batian ngayon sa buong mundo sapagkat ito na ang paghatol ng Diyos. Huling araw, ang huling araw nagkaumaga, hindi na nagkahapon. Kaya ang bati ko kahit tapong gabi, tanghali, umaga, utos ng Diyos yun, umaga, pagkat huling araw na nga, paghatol niya. Ito na ang paghatol ng Diyos. Ang pamagat ng mensaheng ito, una sa lahat, sa ating Diyos Ama na makapangyarihan sa lahat, sa Anak at sa Espiritu Santo, at sa bansang ito, Pilipinas, ngunit sinago ng Diyos, ito ang Siyon. Mayroon 3 tanggulan, Luzon, Visayas at Mindanao. Sinago ng Diyos ang Luzon, bagong Jerusalem, ang Visayas, bagong Bethlehem, ang Mindanao, bagong Israel. Wala na doon sa lumang Israel, mga Palestino, mga Jordan, saka Jerusalem, at saka yung mga sinasabing yung sinasabing Ehipto, mga luma na linuman na ng Diyos. Wala na doon yun. Sa panahon ito, pagbabago na. Kaya nga, ang pamagat ng mensaheng ito, sinasabi, God justice, clean, new way, and unity. In English ko lang kasi mahaba ang Tagalog. Pinagtibay sa Episo 4:13, 2 Hari 23:13, Joel 3:21, Apokalipsis 16:7, Apokalipsis 21:5, Isaias 33:5, 2 Pedro 3:8-9, talata 12 hanggang 13, Hebreo 10:20, talata 26, 27, at talata 31. Sa ikasiyam na katibayan, 2 Corinto 5:10, talata 16 hanggang 19. Ang babasahin, Episo 4:1 hanggang 32. Ngunit bago tayo magbasa sa mga katibayan, sa kasadiretsong pagbabasa, may ipaparinig akong tip. Itong tip na ito galing sa lumang Israel, sa Palestino, kasi naggigira sila ngayon, nagdidigmaan. Kaya nagpaparinig tayo ng tip kasi pangbuong mundo na ang mensahe ng Diyos. Pangbuong mundo. Ito ang sinasabi nila. Ang pamagat nito, Francisco Hill White shares a shocking revelation on the Israel and Palestine war. Ng pamagat.
On murdering the Jewish people in Europe were very bad for all of us. See, this is the thing that people really need to understand. The Nazis were very bad for all of us. I'm not Jewish. And people ask me, well, why are you expending so much energy defending the Jews? You're not even Jewish. And I'm like, this is not an act of charity. I'm defending myself. This is self-defense. This is Western self-defense. Anti-Semitism is a danger to the West. We saw it in World War II. So the anti-Semites, the people that wanted to kill all of the Jews, what did they do? They plunged us into a world war. The entire planet was sucked into their war. Anti-Semites are very bad for us. Very, very bad for us. All of us, whether Jewish or not.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of True Conversations podcast, a podcast dedicated to exploring the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. I can't think of anyone who's trying to explore that truth and find that truth and share that truth with us than Francisco Hill White. Francisco Hill White is an anthropologist, a historian, and a political scientist, and he's the creator of the popular newsletter and online course, Management of Reality. where he's building a system of articles and historical and investigative research covering topics in politics, foreign affairs, corruption, the fight for democracy, and more. And he's been doing a deep dive into what's happening with the Israeli-Palestinian war. And so he's going to share some starking truths about that conflict with us. So Francisco, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm honored and I'm excited and I'm a bit fearful about what you're going to share with us today because it might break the internet. Your research is one that really has blown my mind. But before we get to all of that, could you share with us some bits of your trajectory, a pivotal moment or a turning point in your life that led you to pursue the path you're on today, Francisco?
I think the turning point, of course, there have been many turning points, like there have been for many people, but the one that put me on the specific path I'm on today, I think there were two. So one was 9/11. 9/11 happened. It was a very big shock to my system, and it made me realize that I needed to rethink my model of the news media, because the thing that was very, very shocking to me after the initial shock of the attacks themselves was that the media was behaving in a way that seemed to me more consistent with the Soviet Union than with the United States and Europe that I had in my mind. So I used to believe that the United States was a shining example of democracy. I had been having my doubts. This is true in the years prior to 9/11 because I had been looking more and more at the history of U.S. foreign policy. And as I did that, it seemed to me that history was not really consistent with the promotion of democracy. So I had been having my doubts, but when 9/11 happened and I saw the media not investigate anything because they didn't. They were not interested in finding anything out. They were just repeating what the government said. And they would all, put their American flags on their lapels and Bush, Bush, rah, 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 everything Bush good. When even in the most innocent explanation, there should have been just a storm of condemnation, because even the most innocent explanation means that the U.S. government cannot protect its citizens, right? So all kinds of people should have been fired. There should have been very strong criticism of the government, investigations to find out what happened, blah, blah, blah. But the media was not behaving like that at all. They were all cheering for the U.S. government. So I thought, well, this is very strange. And so that's when I began investigating, just looking around. Investigating is a very big word. I began reading alternative journalism, because that was the time when the blog revolution was taking place, right? So everybody was putting up their own websites and blogs and doing citizen journalism. This was the big first flourishing of citizen journalism was happening right at that time. So I started looking to see if any alternative journalists with their own blogs were actually doing research that was consistent with a free press, because the major media were not doing that. And I found some very interesting people, first among them Jared Israel, who was doing just first-rate work on a website that was called The Emperor's New Clothes. And in that work opened my eyes to many, many things that I was beginning to suspect that I had a very poor handle on. And he had an enormous amount of research that I dived into and started learning from. And that was the beginning. Then I ended up working with him for a few years. And it was a tremendous education for me. I learned a lot from him. So that was the big turning point. And then the second turning point was when, more specifically about the Arab-Israeli conflict, was when in 2003, Israel was accused of committing a massacre in Jenin. So most of your listeners will not even remember this, but Israel was accused of committing a massacre in the so-called UN refugee camp of Jenin. It's really a town. I mean, but they still call it a refugee camp. And Jared and I looked at it, and in no time we realized that there had been no massacre. He was the first one to think there was something fishy about the accusation, and we looked into it, and sure enough, there had been no massacre, but everybody was accusing massacre. Eventually, they had to retract it, but the retraction was in very small print. In the back pages, blah blah blah. It's not. They never make these retractions on the front page or prime time, so the accusations linger. And that's when I became very interested in trying to understand better what was happening with the Arab-Israeli conflict and with the media representation of the conflict. So that's when I dove into the history of Zionism, the history of the Arab-Palestinian movement, and I've been doing a lot of research on that topic ever since.
Wow, Francisco, that's a trajectory. Those are two turning points that are very, very shocking. And I have two questions. I have two pivots here that I myself want to do. But the first one is regarding your trajectory. I know that you were on track for tenure in UPenn, and if you're comfortable with me and with my audience, would you like to share why did UPenn shut down your track to tenure, and what was this truth that you somehow found that not other people were talking about?
Well, actually, that's an excellent segue from what I was just saying, because when I started getting very interested in the Arab-Israeli conflict, one of the thing, and this is the other turning point, I guess, I found. I should make clear, I'm not the first one to find this. It's not an original discovery of mine. I mean, I went into the library and started looking up stuff on the history of the Arab-Palestinian conflict, and I discovered that all of this was already documented. It was all in the library. The Arab-Palestinian movement was created by the same people who carried out the Nazi extermination of the European Jews during World War II. The founding father of the Arab-Palestinian movement is this guy called Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was very, very extremely famous, world famous in the first half of the 20th century, and even still immediately after the war, certainly very famous. But now in the West, he was famous in the West as well as the Muslim world. But now, after World War II, a few years after World War II, the media stopped talking about him. They just dropped the subject of Husseini completely. And after a few decades in the West, nobody could remember him because that's how I found this is how cultural memory works in the modern world. So if the media stops talking about something, it's almost as if they had erased it. They don't need to censor anything. They don't need to go into the libraries and remove anything. They just stop mentioning it, and it disappears from the consciousness of millions of people. But this guy Husseini, who is now largely forgotten by Westerners, was as important as Adolf Hitler. That's the kind of person we're talking about. Yeah, it was very important. He founded the Palestinian movement in 1919, something like that, and he was responsible for big terrorist attacks against the Jews living in British Mandate Palestine. And that history is interesting, but I'm going to skip it. But there were huge terrorist attacks organized by him. And he became the great Mufti of Jerusalem. He was made great Mufti of Jerusalem by the British government, the colonial British government that was controlling the British Mandate Palestine. And from that position, he organized these terrorist attacks. And then the biggest one was called the Arab Revolt. It went from 1936 to 1939. It ended with the outbreak of World War II. Husseini had created such tremendous chaos and violence in British Mandate Palestine that the British finally intervened. So he left. He went to Iraq. In Iraq, he was. You have to understand, this guy had enormous prestige all over the Muslim world. He was an internationally known figure, very respected among many Muslim leaders for his attacks against the Jews in Mandate Palestine. And when he went to Iraq, he was treated as if he were some kind of official leader of Muslims, something like that. So they gave him, a budget. He became almost like a cabinet minister, and he started ordering people about and organized the Farhud, which is a gigantic pogrom of the Jews of Baghdad that pretty much ended Jewish life in Baghdad. Edwin Black, a very important historian, has a very good book on this event. And after doing that, Husseini went on to Italy, where Mussolini received him as if he were a head of state. The fascists were very interested in Husseini and in making an alliance with Husseini, because they were making important alliances with all kinds of rulers and leaders in the Muslim world. The Nazis had an extensive system of diplomacy and alliance with Muslim leaders. And so Husseini was very interesting to them, because Husseini was so famous and had such high prestige all over the Muslim world that many people thought he was going to be the next caliph. Okay, so they received, when Husseini arrived in Rome, Mussolini received him like a head of state, and with all the pomp and circumstance. And then Husseini went on to Berlin, where he was again received like a head of state. Hitler himself came out to receive him with all the dignitaries and the cameras flashing and the film rolling. They treated it as a tremendous event, and Hitler sat down to talk to him for a while. They came to some very important agreements. All of your viewers can go see this. It's all over the internet. They can go to my YouTube channel, The Management of Reality, and see the footage of Husseini meeting Hitler, because we have a short documentary on the history of Husseini and everything else. So they can see it there now. And they agreed, Husseini and Hitler, that they would exterminate the Israeli, they weren't Israelis yet, the Jews living in British Mandate Palestine. They would ethnically cleanse the Middle East of Jews. That was their agreement. They would collaborate together to do that. Now, they couldn't do that because the Nazis were stopped at El Alamein in Egypt. So the Nazis never got to Jerusalem. But the consolation prize for Husseini was that he stayed in the orbit in the Nazi-occupied Europe for the rest of the war. He was very important to the Nazis. They gave him an entire bureaucracy. It was called Bureau des Gros Mufti. They gave him a budget, and he started doing all kinds of things. He was very prominent in Nazi propaganda, inciting Muslims to kill Jews. Muslims allied with the Nazis, for example, in Bosnia and Kosovo. He organized entire divisions of Heinrich Himmler's SS that participated in the Yugoslav chapter of the Holocaust, killing Serbs, Jews, and Roma, the people we often call gypsies. And that was already bad enough. I mean, so he was, that marks him off as a leader of the Holocaust, as an organizer of the Holocaust. But it gets worse, because after the war, the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal was doing all kinds of investigations, and one of those investigations, a very important one, concerned the interrogation of Dieter Wisliczeny, or Wisliczeny, I never know exactly how to pronounce it. He was a Czechoslovak who was the right-hand man to Adolf Eichmann. Now, Adolf Eichmann is the recognized director of the death camp system, of the Final Solution. And according to him, he was executed by the Nuremberg tribunal proceedings. But before he was executed for his war crimes and crimes against humanity, Wisliczeny testified to a bunch of things because he was interviewed very extensively by the prosecutors, and they considered him a very good witness in the sense that he was very meticulous in giving them all kinds of detailed answers to their questions, and he corrected many things that they thought that were mistaken, and they were able to corroborate his corrections and so forth. So this is a very careful witness, somebody who was executed because he was an evil bastard, but who in the last minute of his life decided to be a good witness, and he was a good witness. And what he said about al-Husseini was that Husseini had become, immediately after arriving in Berlin, Husseini arrived in Berlin in late October 1941, and he said that Husseini was the one who had convinced them to switch from a policy of expulsion to a policy of complete extermination. Okay, so that's one thing Wisliczeny said. He said, and historians agree that up until the autumn of 1941, which is when Husseini arrived in Berlin, up until then, although the Nazis were killing many, many Jews, this is true, they had already begun killing many Jews, but they still had a policy of expelling most Jews from the Nazi-occupied area. And they had not yet decided to kill all Jews. That decision was taken in the Wannsee Conference, which is January of 1942, which is after Husseini had already been among them for several months. And according to Wisliczeny, he's the one who convinced them that they had to kill them all, according to Husseini, because they couldn't go to his Palestine. You see, he couldn't contemplate the Jews coming to Palestine, and the Nazis ended up agreeing with him that they should all be killed. So, according to Wisliczeny, this is what Husseini did, and also he became Eichmann's best friend, and together with Eichmann, according to Husseini, according to Wisliczeny, Husseini and Eichmann together organized and directed the entire death camp system. So the father of the Palestinian movement is also the man responsible, with Eichmann and Hitler and Himmler, of murdering the European Jewish population. Well, so that was a big turning point for me, because when I found all of this out, I said to myself, well, something is funny with the world, because why is this guy unknown? You know, we know about Hitler, we know about Himmler, we know about Eichmann. How come we don't know about this guy? And so I started looking at it, and I realized that there had been radio silence about this guy for decades. Nobody had mentioned him. So I thought, well, I should mention him. Somebody should, because the most important intervention in the world of Haj Amin al-Husseini in the post-war, because he didn't escape. They allowed him to escape. They had him in house arrest in the outskirts of Paris at the end of the war. There were parliamentarians in the House of Commons screaming that Husseini had to be tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and why wasn't he being tried at the Nuremberg tribunal? What's going on? You know, they were very upset. He was very famous. They were very upset that no trial had begun. But they had him in house arrest, and of course he just walked out, went to some Arab embassy. They gave him a passport, and he just left. He went to Cairo, where Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian dictator, protected him. Nasser had been allying, like many other Muslim leaders, with the Nazis. So he protected Husseini in Cairo, and in Cairo in the 1950s, with the help of several Nazi refugees, German Nazi refugees that arrived there to also get protection from Nasser, Husseini used some of these people apparently to train Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and a few other adolescents in the 1950s. And this is what became Al-Fatah. So Al-Fatah is a creation of Husseini's Arab Higher Committee. That was his organization. And Al-Fatah, as your viewers may not know, is the core, governing core of what we now call the Palestinian Authority. So Al-Fatah, Nasser had created a group called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a terrorist group. In 1964 is when it was created. But by 1970, Al-Fatah had swallowed the PLO. So Al-Fatah, so the PLO became basically Al-Fatah, although it had other terrorist groups also as appendages. But let's say the governing core, the most important group in the PLO from 1970 onwards is Al-Fatah. So I always say PLO Fatah to make that clear. And PLO Fatah became a very important, the most important terrorist group, killing Jews and Israeli Jews and also people from other countries as part of its campaign against the state of Israel. And well, obviously, being a creation of Husseini, PLO Fatah has the clear mission of finishing the job that Husseini left unfinished, because he could never get to Jerusalem. That was the big lament of his life, was that there were so many Jews still left to kill in the Middle East that he hadn't been able to reach. So Arafat and Abbas were supposed to continue that holy mission of jihad that because PLO Fatah has been represented as a secular group, but you should know that Husseini was all about jihad. It was an entirely religious thing for him. He was the Mufti of Jerusalem, right? And he's the creator of PLO Fatah. So this story we've been hearing about the supposedly secular PLO Fatah is, in my opinion, a crock. It's just not true at all. Just to finish, sorry, I know you're taking air. I've been speaking for a long time. I'm almost done. So PLO Fatah pretended in the run-up to the Oslo Accords to have seen the light and started saying that they wanted peace now in exchange for a piece of territory, blah blah blah, and that's the representation, the narrative that was used to promote the diplomacy that got PLO Fatah inside the Jewish state. So when I saw all this, I said to myself, so the Jewish state was created after World War II to protect Jews from Nazi exterminations. And here we have the organization created by the Nazi exterminator of the European Jews being introduced into the Jewish state to be the government over the Arabs in strategic territory, because it's high ground. Judea and Samaria is high ground, what they call the West Bank. So I thought, well, this is an attack on Israel, obviously. What else could it be? How can it make any sense to introduce into strategic territory of the state created to protect the Jews from extermination, to put there, to rule over the Arabs, the organization created by the guy who killed the European Jews? Nothing could be a bigger aberration. So I thought, well, somebody has to say this, because all of this information is crucial to understanding what the Arab-Israeli conflict really is. So I published this. I published it in Emperor's Clothes, and that was read by people at Israel National News, Arutz Sheva, the religious Zionists in Israel. So they asked me to republish, and the consequence of getting that piece published in Israel National News, was that I was fired from the University of Pennsylvania. And that was a big shock to my system. It made me realize that I didn't understand the system I was in.
There's so many questions. There's a lot to unpack there, Francisco, and thank you for being so thorough. And just so you know, all the space you need to give out your ideas, you don't need to worry about taking beer. That's why I host you. But
Okay. No, but I realize I can go on and on, so I should make pauses.
yeah, yeah. But just to keep that thread. So the first initial question that I have, and then we can unpack a bit more all of the situation, and of course get deeper into the Israeli-Palestinian war. Why did they fire you? Why was this such a revealing truth, and why was it counter to the macro American system, and of course to UPenn? University of Pennsylvania is such a prestigious university.
Right. So your questions are very good because and I think they're helpful as a next sort of a chapter of this, because the model that people have and most people have in their heads. Okay, so first of all, let me backtrack a little bit. I want to talk about how we get our models, because that's a very important question. So we get our models of the world through the media. Have direct contact with the world, right? So none of us is what you witness directly is almost nothing. So you have a few interactions with your friends, with your family, the world you see when you're driving around in your car or walking in your neighborhood. There are a very few things that you do witness personally and directly, but that's it. Almost everything you believe about the world, even about your own city, almost everything you believe is true about what's happening in your own city, it all comes to you through the media. What's happening in Russia, what's happening in Israel, China, India, Mexico, the US, anything, it's all the media. So the media constructs your reality. And therefore, if the media has been saying that the United States government is the biggest ally of Israel, and that you hear academics everywhere in every university repeating this, if you hear supporters of Israel saying it over and over again, and you hear enemies of Israel saying the same thing over and over again, and you hear the governments of both countries, the governments of every country, but also the government of the United States and the government of Israel, all of them saying that the United States is the biggest ally of Israel, well, then that becomes your model. It becomes your geopolitical model, right? Why? Because you have no other access to reality, unless you start doing historical research like I did. But most people have no inclination, time, or energy to do any of that, or even the skills a lot of the time. Although I think the citizen journalism is proving that these skills can be developed relatively quickly. It's not nuclear physics. All citizens can start doing this, and they should. So the model you have in your head is the model that the media puts in your head. So what I'm saying is very surprising if your model is that the United States government is the biggest ally of Israel. Now, when you get evidence that dramatically contradicts that, then you have to search for a different model, one that will be consistent with the facts. And so that's what I started doing. The first thing I started doing is I started looking into the entire history of U.S. foreign policy towards Israel. And I have a little ebook published in my old website, which is still available as an archive. It's called Historical and Investigative Research. So I published there a book, an ebook that traces the entire history of U.S. foreign policy towards the Jews and then towards Israel. And I was then able to see the pattern, and the pattern was not one of alliance. The pattern was one of the United States consistently doing important stuff to weaken the security of the Israeli state, while claiming all the time in public that they were supporting the Israeli state, right? So that began to open my eyes even more. I was like, oh, okay, well then this is consistent with not telling people who Husseini is, pretending that PLO Fatah has changed its colors, and inventing a diplomatic process to bring PLO Fatah into Israel, and threatening Israel, because they threatened Israel with the removal of U.S. aid, military and financial, if Israel didn't participate in the Oslo process to bring PLO Fatah into Israel. All of that happened, right? So in the context of this larger history that I was now researching, it became clear to me that this was consistent. It made sense that the U.S. had a consistent pattern of undermining the security of the Israeli state. And then I discovered Edwin Black. Thanks to Jared. Jared is the guy who got me to read Edwin Black. And Edwin Black had written a book called War Against the Weak. War Against the Weak is one of the most important books ever written in all of history, in my opinion. It's definitely for the understanding of modern history, because Edwin Black resurrected from oblivion a subject that is most important. Just like Husseini, the same thing that happened with Husseini, where for decades they stopped talking about him, right? And then it disappeared from the consciousness of democratic citizenry in the West. Everybody just forgot about Husseini because the media didn't mention him, right? The same thing happened with eugenics. So eugenics was not a secret when it was happening. It was an open thing. It was a gigantic international movement. It was especially big in the United States. It was biggest in the United States for a long time until Germany overtook it. But eugenics was a gigantic U.S. phenomenon. And this is important because eugenics is the original ideology of the alleged biological superiority of Germanic peoples. That's what eugenics is. And it had a whole pseudoscientific apparatus behind it. So huge fortunes were spent raising the prestige of certain biologists and psychologists and social scientists and so forth who were defending this idea. And it was dressed up in pseudoscience. So what they would tell people is that the poor people were poor because they were stupid, because they had bad genes. Rich people and powerful people were rich and powerful because they're smart, because they had good genes. These are the people that started using IQ tests to diagnose the intelligence of people and so forth. It's a big fraud. It's a big scientific fraud. And the program was to use these IQ tests to, quote unquote, prove that people in the lower classes had lower intelligence because they had bad genes, and justify with that, quote unquote, diagnosis horrific things like putting people in special prisons that they called colonies for epileptics and feeble-minded until their reproductive period was over, which for men is until they die. Or they would sterilize them, forcibly sterilize people so they couldn't reproduce. Or they separated people who were married. They did horrific things. And hundreds of thousands of people, according to Edwin Black's documentation, were treated this way in the United States, in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. And there were gigantic, these big monopolists, the biggest industrialists in the United States were financing this. The people like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, and others were sinking just billions of dollars into this. So all of this was happening in the United States, and the same people who were promoting this in the United States were exporting it internationally. And a lot of this money was going to Germany to make German eugenics flourish. The German eugenicists were learning everything from the Americans. So one of the things that your listeners should know is that the Nuremberg laws of 1935 were modeled on the legal developments in the U.S., where everything had been done first. So the Nuremberg laws of the Nazis in 1935 are the laws that are the backbone of the entire T4 project, which is when they began carting off people they considered inferior into concentration camps. This is not yet extermination of the entire Jewish people. That was not happening yet, but they were certainly carting off certain categories of people to concentration camps with those laws, and those were modeled after what had been achieved in the United States. So once you put all of this context together, and you realize that the people in Great Britain and the United States who were at the very top of the power structure were devotees of the same ideology that we associate with Adolf Hitler, right? So eugenics is the parent movement that produced German Nazism. It was one of the quotes of Edwin Black's book. He says it ended up in Auschwitz, but it started in Long Island or something like that. It's the other way around. It started in Long Island, it ended up in Auschwitz, because the American eugenicists, with Andrew Carnegie's money and Rockefeller's money and so forth, they created a gigantic complex in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and they were collecting statistics about all kinds of stuff about Americans, U.S. citizens, to find out, who was going to be oppressed, who was going to be put in jail, and who was going to be forcibly sterilized, and all this stuff. So that's where Nazism comes from, and once you understand that, the post-war behaviors of the U.S. power elite towards Israel are easier to understand. It becomes less of an aberration because your model is now changing. Now you can see, oh, I see. So the people running the United States in the first half of the 20th century had a movement that is basically the same ideology as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and they were actually supporting the growth of that in Germany, sending money, and they were controlling the U.S. government, right? They got the U.S. Supreme Court in 1924 to approve forced sterilization, and those same people put Roosevelt in the White House. The Rockefellers were quite instrumental in supporting Roosevelt's presidential campaign, and of course they were very powerful. They were doing this out of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Once you adopt this other model, of course, new questions come into view which need to be solved. So, for example, one obvious question is, well, then what was World War II? Right? Because there was a declaration of war between the United States and Germany. So what about that, right? And that means that you need to start looking into the details of the war, which I did. I now have an entire book series on this. But just not to make the story too long, one of the things you need to look again at when you start changing your model is appeasement. And in this narrative, Neville Chamberlain and the earlier rulers of Britain and Daladier in France and even Roosevelt in the United States are represented as innocents. So they were not too smart in this narrative. They didn't understand Hitler well enough or in time. They were too stubborn, didn't want to believe that this guy really meant what he said. And they were also cowardly. So when at opportune moments, they could have stopped Hitler with a very small cost, relatively small cost. But they were too timid. They didn't act in time. They were not forceful enough. And they developed a policy of trying to see if they could make Hitler happy by giving him the things he wanted and thus appeasing him. This is where the word comes from, appeasing him, and in that way avoid a general war, right? So this is the narrative that emerges. This is what we all learn in school. Appeasement was a big mistake. These people were idiots. They were cowards. When you read carefully this narrative, it cannot explain anything. Peter, this doesn't make any sense. Just look at what they did. They gave Hitler, they allowed him to build submarines. They allowed him to reoccupy the Rhineland. They allowed him to, swallow Austria and then kill Czechoslovakia. And so at every juncture, and I'm giving you the big ones, there are also smaller details, and at every little or large juncture where the Western leaders made a decision that ended up helping Hitler strategically. If you're an astronomer, say, you're interested in the movements of heavenly bodies, and you have a theory of these heavenly bodies, right? You have a model of how they're supposed to work. And as you look at their movements and you chart their trajectories, you keep saying to yourself, well, that the moon shouldn't be there. What's Mars doing over there? Wait a minute. What, the comet? You mean the comet goes from here to here? Well, that's absurd. That doesn't make any sense. If that's the way you're talking about the heavenly bodies, what it means is that you have a terrible model. You don't understand gravity. You don't understand how these bodies relate to each other, right? When you have a good model, you stop talking like that. Everything suddenly makes sense. Well, of course it's going over there, but my equations predicted it should go over there. And yeah, the moon is doing this because the Earth is over here and the sun is pulling it and so forth, right? When you have a good model, the puzzles disappear. That's the whole point of having a good model. So the fact that Scheider and every other historian of World War II talks about appeasement as something that is inexplicable means that they're simply wrong. They have the wrong model of what was going on. Now, when you substitute this model that they gave us, where Western leaders who had to deal with Hitler were supposedly idiots and cowards, you replace it with the model that...
Yan. Hanggang dyan lang naman ang kwento niya. Yung nagpapaulit-ulit lang ang kwento kasi ang ikinikwento, yung mula kay Hitler, saka yung mula kay Mussolini, Hitler, digmaan sa pangalawang digmaan. Kay Mussolini naman, noong panahon ng, kasi pumasok sa unang digmaan, pumasok dito sa Asia, dito sa Pilipinas. Ang unang digmaan naman, kinikwento niya si Mussolini. Tapos hindi na natatapos, ganun pa rin naman ang kwento. Kaya pinutol ko na. Yung mga kwento ng mga unang panahon, kagaya ng mga Hudyo, mga Hintil, mga ay tinapos na ng Diyos. Kasi yung mga unang panahon na mga kwento, lahi pa yun ng mga barbaro, lahi ng mga Hudyo, lahi ng mga Hintil, lahi ng mga ulupong, sabi ng Panginoon, ay tinapos na itong panahon. De yung mga kwento, inarinig ko lang naman sa inyo kasi kayo, itong mensaheng itong panahon, Tagalog na. Tagalog na ang mamumuno ngayon, panbuong mundo. Tapos na yung English, Kastila, mga namuno na yon, Roma, mga namuno na yon. Ay, panahon ito, ang namumuno naman, Tagalog. Ngunit ipinarinig ko kahit English para maintindihan yung pasimulang aral ng mga Hudyo, mga Hintil, mga barbaro. Sinabi ng Panginoon, mga panahon pa ng ulupong, lahi pa ng ulupong, ibig sabihin, isnik, lahi ng mga kadiliman, itim, isnik, dragon, mga tinapos na ng Diyos. Ngayon, ang ginagawa ng Diyos, pagkakaisa, pagbabago, pagkakaisa, pagbabago, at saka paglilinis. Kasi nga, una sa lahat, ang Diyos malinis eh. Gusto ng Diyos, itutulad kayo, malinis. Di wala na yung lahing ulupong, wala na yung lahing barbaro, Hintil, Hudyo, wala na yon. Binago na ngayon ng Diyos panahon ito, huling araw na. kinakailangan buong mundo sa panahon ito kumilala sa tinig ng Tagalog ng Diyos. Kung kumilala sa tinig na Tagalog, kasi ang Diyos Tagalog sa panahon ito, huling araw, ay hindi na kayo magiging lahing ulupong, lahing barbaro, lahing Hudiyo, lahing Hintil. Magiging lahi na kayo na Diyos. Tinapos na yung mga kahangalan, kasi tungkol sa mga lahi-lahi, kahangalan yon. Ang inaano ng Diyos, pagkakaisa. Paano? Ay kailangan maging lahi ng Diyos. Yan tayo magkakaisa. Buong mundo, tinapos na ang mga wika ng mga unang araw kasi naghari na. Ngayon, ang maghaharing wika, dalisay na wika, Tagalog, pambuong mundo. Kaya ang salitang ito, inihato na yun, Biblia, salitang Tagalog. Wala na yung mga kwento kanina. Pinarinig ko lang kung anong kalagayan ng mga panahon. Talagang walang direksyon kasi hindi naman ginagamitan ng salita ng Diyos. Ngayon, ginagamitan ng salita ng Diyos, may direksyon. Kailangan sumunod sa Diyos, sumunod sa salita ng Diyos, sumunod sa tinig ng Diyos, sumunod para maging lahi ng Diyos. Ngayon, ang pamagat ng mensaheng ito, ini-English lang kasi mahaba nga ang Tagalog. Yung YouTube, hindi tumatanggap na mahabang pamagat. Ang English, pinagbibigyan pa sapagkat simple. Ang Diyos naman, mapagbigay, maunawain, malawak ang unawa. Kaya nga, kung kayo sa Diyos, ay kung anong lawak ng buong mundo, ganun din ang lawak ng kaisipan, ng unawa, ng isang pangulo, ng isang bansa. Ang pamagat na ito, God, justice, peace. God, justice, clean, new way, and unity. Yan ang pamagat. Pinagtibay sa, babasahin na natin, Efeso 4:13. Sinasabi dito, Efeso 4:13. Efeso 4:13. Sinasabi nito, 4. Dito sa Efeso 4:7. Efeso 4:13. Hanggang sabutin natin lahat ang pagkakaisa. Ito na yun, kasi pambuong mundo ang lakad ng Diyos. Hanggang sabutin natin lahat ang pagkakaisa ng pananampalataya at ang pagkakilala sa anak ng Diyos hanggang sa lubos na paglaki ng tao, hanggang sa sukat ng pangatawanan ng kapuspusan ni Kristo. Ibig sabihin, magkakaisa tayo sa Diyos, sa Kristo. Ano pa? Si Jesus, yung naipako sa cross. Binuhay na magmuli ng Diyos. Kaya kasama na tatlo, ang Diyos, Ama, ang Kristo, kasi Espiritu Santo, katawan tao, ang Jesus, anak ng Diyos, nagkatawan tao na. Kaya yung tatlo nagkakaisa. Kung sila nagkakaisa, ay tayo kinakailangan abutin natin ang pagkakaisa sa Diyos at ni Kristo Jesus. Dito sa Dos Hari 21:13 sa Lumang Tipan. Dos Hari 21:13. Dito. At aking paabutin sa Jerusalem ang pising panukat ng Samaria at ang pabato ng bahay ni Akab at aking lilinisin ang Jerusalem gaya ng paglinis ng isang tao ng isang pinggan na nilinis at itinataob. Yan. Kaya nga, paglilinis, pagbabago, pagkakaisa. Dito sa Joel 3:21, sinasabi nito, Joel 3:21, dito, 3:21, at aking lilinisin ang kanilang dugo na hindi ko lininis, sapagkat ang Panginoon ay tumahan sa Sion. Ibig sabihin, dito sa bansang Sion, Pilipinas, dito lilinisin ang buong mundo. Na lilinisin ang mga hari, pari, propeta, mga pastor, ministro, lilinisin ng Diyos. Bakit? Ay hindi pa naman nalilinis sila buhat ng una kasi nga pinatay. Pangalawang dating para magnanakaw. Ang paglilinis ay pangatlong dating. Pagkakaisa na ng buong mundo. So dito sa Apokalipsis 16:7, ang paghatol ng Diyos hindi masama, pagkakaisa, paglilinis, pagbabago. Ayon sa Gawa o Apokalipsis 16, sinasabi dito, Apokalipsis 16:7, sinasabi, at narinig ko ang dambana na nagsasabi, O Panginoon Diyos na makapangyarihan sa lahat, tunay at matuwid ang iyong mga hatol. Yan. Matuwid ang hatol ng Diyos. Dito sa 21:5, nasabi, Apokalipsis 21:5. Sa panahon nito, talagang matuwid ang hatol ng Diyos. Sa 5 sinasabi, at yaong nakaluklok sa luklukan ay nagsabi, ibig sabihin nakaluklok sa luklukan, ang Ama, ang Anak, Espiritu Santo, nakaluklok sila. Nagsabi, narito, ginawa kong bago ang lahat ng mga bagay. Narito, ginawa kong bago ang lahat ng mga bagay. At sinabi niya, isulat mo, sapagkat ang mga salitang ito ay tapat at tunay. Yan. Ibig sabihin, ang bansang Sion, kasi Pilipinas ito ginawang Sion. Ginawa ng Sion. Dating pangalan naman ito, binago lang ito ni Haring Felipe, ng Kastila. Pero dating Sion ito. Ngayon, binalik, pangalan Sion, inalis ang Pilipinas. Yun ang sinasabi. Binago. Watawat, babaguhin. Batas, babaguhin. Ha? Tao, pagka lumapit sa Diyos, ay mababago. Mababago. Yan ang sinasabi. Ang hatol ng Diyos, pagbabago, pagkakaisa, paglilinis. Yan ang sinasabi, new way. Ngayon dito, sa Isaiah 33:5, ang binabasa natin, dalawang tipan, lumang tipan at saka bagong tipan. Ito ang dalawang tabak na matalas. Isaiah 33:5, sabi dito, Isaiah 33:5. Ang Panginoon ay nahayag sapagkat siya'y tumahan sa mataas, kanyang pinuno ang Siyon ng kahatulan at katuwiran. Ibig sabihin, ang Diyos na buhay dito sa Siyon ay pinakamataas. Ibig sabihin, hari siya ng mga hari. Anak, hari ng mga hari. Ang ama, ama ng mga ama. Ang Espiritu Santo, banal yun eh. Banal ng mga banal. Yan ay ibig sabihin. Kasi maraming banal eh. Wala nang higit sa Espiritu Santo. Banal siya ng mga banal eh. Ngayon, ang tanong, kayo mga banal na nagsasabi, ay paano kayo maging banal talaga? Hindi naman kayo lumalapit. Ang banal, lumalapit sa banal. Kung ikaw sinasabi mo sakdal ka, ay magpapakasakdal ka pa. Kasi ang Diyos sakdal. Dito sa 2 Pedro 3:8-9, talata 12 hanggang 13. 2 Pedro. Sinasabi dito sa 2 Pedro 3:8. Datapwat huwag ninyong kalimutan, mga minamahal, ang isang bagay na ito, na ang isang araw sa Panginoon ay katulad ng 1,000 taon. Katulad ng 1,000 taon. Ang isang araw. At ang 1,000 taon ay katulad ng isang araw. Sabihin, kailan dumating ito? Ay sa panahon na ito. Ito na yung 1,000 taon. Isang araw lang sa Diyos. Maybe, hindi mapapaliban ang Panginoon tungkol sa kanyang pangako na gaya ng pagpaliban itinalagay ng iba, kundi mapagpahinuhod sa inyo na hindi niya ibig na sinumang ay mapahamak, kundi ang lahat ay magsipagsisi. Yan. Nagsisi. Kung naman nagsisi ka na bago ka, nakiisa ka sa Diyos, nalinis ka. Kung magsisi, lalapit ka sa Diyos. 12. Na ating hinihintay at pinakananasa ang pagdating ng kaarawan ng Diyos, na dahil dito'y ang sangkalangitan nagniningas ay mapupugnaw at ang mga bagay na sa langit ay matutunaw sa matinding init. Ibig sabihin, kayong mga hari, yung sinasabing mo, masusunog kayo sa matinding init. Bakit? Bakit masusunog? Ay makasalanan kayo eh. Makasalanan kayo. Kung lalapit kayo sa Diyos na buhay, masusunog din kayo. Kaya lang, may ingatan ang pagkasunog sapagkat 3 beses ang pagkasunog eh. 3. Parang ginto yan eh, iniaalay. Talagang sinusubok. Yung talagang ginto. Anong pagsubok sa ginto? Sinusunog sa apoy. Unang pagsunog, ang unang pagsunog, may tinablan. Ibig sabihin, naalis lang kasalanan niya. Pangalawang pagkasunog, ay nag-alinlangan eh. Nag-alinlangan. Ibig sabihin, hanggang bibig lang ang pananampalataya ay talagang masusunog tuluyan. Pero ang pangatlong pagsunog, ayon sa gawa. Kung ang gawa mo, sinasang-ayunan ng Diyos, ay susunugin ka, lalo kang titibay. Titibay. Kaya nga, masusunog ang sinasabi dito sa matinding init. Ay yung pangatlong pagsunog, bagamat man sinusunog, lalong kumintabi. Ang ginto, pag laging pangatlong sunog sa ginto, lalong kumikintab yan. Lalong nagiging dalisay habang sinusunog. Kinakailangan maging ginto kayo. O paano? Lumapit kayo sa Diyos. Ang Diyos ang naglalas ng tunay na ginto. 13. Ngunit ayon sa kanyang pangako, ay naghihintay tayo ng bagong langit at bagong lupa na tinatahanan ng katuwiran. Ito na yan. Kung makalapit kayo, ang inyong hinihintay na bagong langit at bagong lupa ay ibibigay sa iyo ng Diyos. Kasi ang Diyos kung mangako, tapat. Sinasabi dito sa 9, hindi mapagpaliban ng Panginoon tungkol sa kanyang pangako. Ano ba yung pangako ay binibigay ng Diyos? Ay, buhay na walang hanggang. Buhay na walang bibigyan ka. Kaya nga, sinasabi dito, yung mga naghihintay, lumapit sa Diyos. Ang bagong langit at bagong lupa na tinatanan ng katuwiran, ay nasa Diyos yun eh. Kung lumapit kayo, matatagpuan ninyo. Dito sa Hebreo 10:20 hanggang 22, sinasabi dito, Hebreo 10:20. Sa pamamagitan ng daan bago at buhay na kanyang itinalaga sa atin, sa pamamagitan ng tabing sa makatid bagay sa kanyang laman, sabihin tao, katawan tao, ang tabing, katawan tao, ibig sabihin, ang Panginoon yan. Saan matatagpuan? Sa daan bago. 21. At yamang may isang dakilang saserdote na pangulo sa bahay ng Diyos, tayo'y magsilapit na may tapat na puso, na lubos na pananampalataya, na ang ating mga puso na winisikan mula sa isang masamang budhi at mahugasan ang ating katawan ng dalisay na tubig. Yan. Ibig sabihin, nilinisin ka, lumapit. Huhugasan ka ng dalisay na tubig. Dito sa 26, sinasabi dito sa 26, sapagkat kung ating sinasadya ang pagkakasala, pagkatapos na ating matanggap ang pagkakilala sa katotohanan, ay walang nanghaing matitira tungkol sa mga kasalanan. Sa mga katuwid, kung lumapit kayo, tinanggap na ninyo ay sasabihin sa inyo ng Diyos, huwag ka nang magkasala. Kasi kung magkasala ka pa, itong sinasabi dito, wala nang haing natitira pa tungkol sa mga kasalanan. Ibig sabihin, wala nang kapatawaran. Ha? Ngayon, sapagat hindi kayo lumalapit, ay anong mangyayari sapagat hindi kami lumapit? Ay, anong mangyayari? Di bubulid kayo sa impyerno? Nalaman nyo pala, nung pinapalapit kayo, ayaw nyo. Ha? Anong mangyayari? Ito, sinasabi dito sa 27. Kundi isang kakilakilabot na paghihintay sa paghukom at isang kabangisan ng apoy na lalamon sa mga kaaway. Pag hindi kayo lumapit sa paghatol na ito ng Diyos, kaaway kayo. Ay sa paghatol, lalamunin kayo. Dito sa 28, ang magpawalang halaga sa kautusan ni Moises sa patutunang 2 o 3 saksi ay mamatay na walang awa. Yan. Ngayon, ay malalaman yung hindi lumalapit. Bakit? Ay, mayroong saksi. 2 magsasabi na hindi yan lumapit. Ha? Ito sinasabi dito. Patutuon ng 2 o 3 saksi. Ay, sinabi ng 3 saksi, ay hindi yan lumapit, Panginoon, papatayin ka. Ha? Yung 3 saksi, hindi basta-basta yan, nakapangyarihan yan. Pag yan ang nagsabi na hindi nakalapit yan sa harap ng Diyos, kung kailan doon na ang pagtawag na kailangan lumapit, doon ka lalapit, ay wala nang matitirang hain. Kung maaari, sa panahon ito, sa panawagan ng Justice Pablo, lumapit na kayo. Kasi walang matitirang hain. Ang kasalanan ninyo ngayon, tuloy-tuloy ang pagkakasala ninyo. Hindi kayo patatawarin. Kaya sinasabi dito sa 29, gaano kayang higpit ng parusa sa akala ninyo ang ihahatol sa naukol doon sa yumurak ng anak ng Diyos at umaring di banal sa dugo ng tipan na nagpapabanal sa kanya at umaalipusta ng biyaya. Yan. Kung hindi kayo lumalapit kayong mga hari, pastor, ministro, at yan, mga general, mga senador, kongreso, hanggang sa mga gobernador, hindi kayo lalapit, ay lumalabas na yung tipan. Yung tipan na sa panawagan ito na sinasabi lumapit kayo. At hindi naman ako, di bagamat ako dito nagsasalita. Ang tipan ng Diyos, ay sa panahon ito nakikipagtipan ng Diyos, nakikipagkasundo. Sa pamagitan ng live na ito, Justice Pablo, tinatawagan kayo, ay ayaw ninyo dumating. Ito, sinasabi dito, kasi kung ayaw ninyo dumating, pinagbibingihan nyo lang. Ay Espiritu Santo ito. At saka ang anak, dumating na. Binuhay na magmuli ng Diyos. Ayaw ninyo lumapit, ay inaalipusta ninyo. Hindi ninyo inaaring banal. Na ang Diyos naman ang nagbanal ng sinasabing Espiritu, ang biyaya. 30. Sapagkat ating nakikilala yung nagsabi, akin ang paghihiganti, ako ang gaganti, at muli uhukman ng Panginoon ang kanyang bayan. Kakilakilabot na bagay ang mahulog sa kamay ng Diyos na buhay. Yan. pangsiyam ito. 2 Corinto 5:10, pangsiyam. Yung pang-10, magbabasa na tayo. Dito sinasabi sa pangsiyam na katibayan. 2 Corinto 5:10. 5:10, tapos talatang 16 hanggang 19. Sinasabi dito, 5:10. Sapagkat tayong lahat ay kinakailangan mahayag sa harapan ng hukuman ni Kristo upang tumanggap ang bawat isa ng mga bagay na ginawa sa pamamagitan ng katawan ayon sa ginawa niya, maging mabuti o masama. Kinakailangan lahat, lahat, buong mundo, mga hari, kauna-unahan, sapagkat sila ama ng bansa, lahat kailangan humarap sa hukuman ni Kristo. Lahat, buong mundo ito, sapagkat ang Biblia, kasulatan ng Diyos, 66 book ito na hinihahatol sa buong mundo, mga hari. Bakit mga hari ang inuuna? Ay, hari ng mga hari ang nanawagan, Diyos ng mga Diyos, Ama ng mga ama nanawagan. Isa lang naman ang ating Ama. Sino ba Ama? Ay, sino ba? Di ba si Abraham? Ang lumuklok? Nandoon katabi niya yung mahirap na tao, si Lazaro. At ang mayaman naman nagsisigaw-sigaw. Nasa impyerno. Kapag sabay sila ni Lazaro, ay si Lazaro, dinampot ng anghel, dinala sa sinapupunan ni Amang Abraham. Ang sabi ng mayaman nandun sa impyerno, ay Amang Abraham, utusan mo si Lazaro, itubog ang kanyang daliri at ibisikan ang mga labi ko, nag-aalab ng init. Ay anong sabi niya Amang Abraham? Ay, tinanggap mo na ang ikabubuti, kasiyahan. Ikaw ay naging mayaman, ngunit si Lazaro, dumating sa iyo, nandun sa silong ng iyong lamisa. Ay, hindi mo man lang pinansin na kumakain ng mumo. Ay ngayon, siya inaaliw ko, sabi niya mga Abraham. Ay ikaw magdusa, kabayaran ng iyong kasalanan. Yan, ipinahiwatig ng Diyos na ito nga rin ang mangyayari sa huling araw. Ngayon na hindi kumikilala, hindi kayo nagbibigay ng ika-10 bahagi. Sa panahon ito, ay mga hari, ay bulit kayo sa impyerno. Dito, kailangan humarap sa hukuman ni Kristo. Talata 16, sinasabi dito, kaya nga, mula ngayon ay hindi namin nakikilala ang sinuman ayon sa laman. Ayon sa laman, bagamat nakikilala namin si Kristo ayon sa laman. Ngayon, hindi na natin nakikilala ang siyang gano'n. Kaya nga, diyan sa Quiapo, yung nakahiga dyan, o yung nakatayo, o kaya yung nakaupo na Kristong itim, Nazareno, itigil na yan para hindi na kayo may bulid sa impyerno. Alisin ang mga cross na may nakapako. Alisin yan, linisin yan. Unang-una, pinag-uutos yan sa Pangulo. At ako dito, tagapagsalita lang naman, ginawa kong ministro ni Kristo Jesus. Katungkulan yan na dapat ganapin ng isang Pangulo ng bansa, ng buong mundo. Paglilinisin ang mga santuaryo na dumhan, dinungisan ng dugo, Ngayon, kailangan alisin para maging malinis. Buong mundo. Dito sa bansang ito, Pilipinas, Luzon, Visayas at Mindanao, ay noong Enero 1 hanggang 6, 9, 2 milyon katao. Yapo, diretso doon sa Lunita. Daming mga, ay, sa Diablo nga yan, sinasang-ayunan pa ni Noli de Castro, kung announcer ito, di nakakaalam samantala. Noong 1980, ito si Noli de Castro. Nakakita ito ng paglahad ng gobyerno ng Diyos Pandaigdig. Ang sabi ni Noli de Castro, ano yan? Impostor yan. Sabi ni Noli de Castro. Announcer na siya. Hanggang ngayon, announcer pa rin. Pero nag-vice president siya. Ay, ngayon, kasama niya ang mga Diablo, mga Diyos-Diyosan, itim. 2 milyon kasama ni Noli de Castro. Sinasabi na hindi na namin nakilala siyang gayon. Bagamat si Kristo ayon sa laman, ibig sabihin, nagkatawan tao si Kristo, buhay. Hindi yung nakahiga, hindi yung nakatayo, hindi yung nakaupo, puro kahoy yan. Ay, sinasamba pa ninyo, inaaruga, 2 milyon tao. Samantala nung panahon ni former President Duterte, wala naman yan. Ngayon lang yan, Pangulo Marcos, hindi nakakasaway. Bakit? Bakit niya hindi nakakasaway? Ay, Diablo kakampi niya. Ba't sasawayin niya? Kakampi niya. 17. Kaya't kung ang sino man ay na kay Kristo, siya ay bagong nilalang. Tunayan, kaya sabi ng Diyos, ang hatol niya pagbabago. Ang tao, babaguhin. Pag binago, bagong nilalang na. Ito yung sinasabi. Siya ay bagong nilalang. Ang mga dating bagay ay nangalipas na. Narito sila ay pawang naging mga bago. 18. Datapat ang lahat ng mga bagay ay pawang sa Diyos na pinapagkasundo niya tayo sa Kanya. Sa Kanya rin sa pamamagitan ni Kristo at ibinigay sa amin ang ministeryo sa pagkakasundo. Kaya nga may channel, yung channel na ito, paraan ito na magkasundo ang mga hari, magkasundo mga ministro, pastor, magkasundo. Sabi ng Diyos, 19, sa makatid bagay na ang Diyos kay Kristo ay pinakipagkasundo ang sanglibutan sa Kanya rin. Yan, buong mundo, na hindi ibinibilang sa kanila ang kanilang mga kasalanan at pinagkatiwala sa amin ang salita ng pagkakasundo. Bakit nga hindi binibilang ang kasalanan? Ay nakipagkasundo sa Diyos Kahit anong kasalanan, malaking kasalanan. Ay kung nakipagkasundo ka, hindi nga ibibilang ang iyong kasalanan. Pag sinasabi dito, hindi ibibilang sa kanila ang kanilang mga kasalanan at ipinagkatiwala sa amin ang salita ng pagkakasundo. Kaya nga, ang kasulatan binabasa, itong salitang ito. 20. Kami nga'y mga sugo sa pamagitan ni Kristo, na waring namamanhik ang Diyos sa pamagitan namin, kayo'y pinamamanhikan namin sa pangalan ni Kristo na kayo'y makipagkasundo sa Diyos. Ngayon, makipagkasundan, anong gagawin? Ay, kayong mga general, nakakaalam nito na mensaheng itong Justice Pablo, kung ang Pangulo, bising-bisi sa kanyang sarili, ay dalhin mo sa harap ng Diyos, ang mga general. Huwag kayong makiisa sa isang Pangulo na hindi kumikilala sa Diyos na buhay. Kakasala rin kayo, kasama kayo. Kasama kayo sa kasalanan ng isang Pangulo na hindi kumikilala sa Diyos na buhay. Ngayon magbabasa na tayo sa diretso, Efeso 4:1 hanggang 32. Ayon sa Efeso. Sinasabi nito, Efeso 4:1. Namamanhik nga sa inyo, ako bilanggo sa Panginoon, na kayo magsilakad ng nararapat na pagkatawag na sa inyo itinawag, ng buong kapakumbabaan at kamuan na may pagpapahinuhod, na magbatang kayo sa pag-ibig, na pagsakitan ninyo ingatan ang pakikipagkaisa sa Espiritu, sa Espiritu, sa tali ng kapayapaan. Sabihin ito na, yung pagkakaisa, kung nakikiisa, sa Espiritu tayo nagkakaisa. 4, may isang katawan at may isang Espiritu, gaya naman ng pagkatawag sa inyo sa isang pag-asa ng pagtawag sa inyo. Isang Panginoon, isang pananampalataya, isang bautismo. Ito na yan, sabi pagkakaisa. Isang Diyos at Ama ng lahat, na siyang nasa ibabaw sa lahat at sumasa lahat at nasa lahat. Datapwat ang bawat isa sa atin ay binigyan ng biyaya ayon sa sukat sa kaloob ni Kristo. Kaya sinasabi niya, nang umakyat siya sa itaas, ay dinala niyang bihag ang pagkabihag at nagbigay ng mga kaloob sa mga tao. Ngayon ito, umakyat siya. Ano ito? Kundi siya bumaba rin naman sa mga dakong kalaliman ng lupa. Ibig sabihin, nandito na ang Panginoon, bumaba sa dakong kalaliman ng lupa. Anong kalaliman ng lupa? Ay yung mga mahirap. Ang Panginoon nakihalo sa mga mahirap na tao. Yes. Ang bumaba ay siya rin namang umakyat ang bumaba ay siya rin naman umakyat sa kaitaasan ng kanyang sa lambong sangkalangitan, upang kanyang mapuspos ang lahat ng mga bagay. At pinagkalooban niya ang mga iba ng maging mga apostol, at mga iba'y propeta, at ang mga iba'y ebanghilista, at mga iba'y pastor, at mga guro, sa ikasasakdal ng mga banal, sa gawang paglilingkod, sa ikatitibay ng katawan ni Kristo, hanggang sa abutin natin lahat ang pagkakaisa ng pananampalataya at ang pagkakilala sa anak ng Diyos, hanggang sa ang lubos na paglaki ng tao, hanggang sa sukat ng pangatawanan ng kapuspusan ni Kristo. Kaya nga, pinapalapit kayo upang humarap na sa hukuman ni Kristo. Bakit? Nandito na nga, puspos na. Puspos ng katotohanan at katuwiran, tastasan katuwiran. Upang tayo huwag nang maging mga bata pa na napapahapay dito at doon, at dinadala sa magkabila ng lahat ng hangin ng aral sa pamamagitan ng madaya ng mga tao sa katusuhan ayon sa mga lalang ng kamalian. Kaya nga, yung dyan itinasarino, dinadaya kayo. Kayo ng mga taga-Quiapo hanggang doon sa Lunita at taga iba't ibang lugar ng Pilipinas, nadadaya. Yung sinasabi dito, dinadalang aral sa pamamagitan ng madaya ng mga tao sa katusuhan ayon sa mga lalang ng kamalian, kundi sa pagsasalita ng katotohanan na may pag-ibig. May pag-ibig ba yun nangyari? Ang daming nasaktan. Ay magsilaki sa lahat ng mga bagay sa Kanya na siyang Pangulo sa mga bagay si Kristo. Kaya nga, kilalanin ninyo ang Kristo. Siyang Pangulo ng mga Pangulo. Ay, hindi ninyo kilalanin. Kalabang kayo nan. Na dahil sa Kanya, ang buong katawan na nakalapat sa mabuti at nagkakalakip sa pamamagitan ng tulong ng bawat kasukasuan ay ayon sa paggawang naukol sa bawat iba't ibang sangkap ay nagpapalaki sa katawan sa ikatitibay sa kanyang sarili sa pag-ibig. Ito nga ang sinasabi ko at sinasaksihan sa Panginoon na kayo'y hindi na nagsisilakad pa na gaya naman ng lakad ng mga hintil sa pagpapalalo sa kanilang pag-isip. Kaya nga, hindi na tayo hintil, hindi na tayo Hudiyo, hindi na tayo barbaro, hindi na tayo ulupong na lahi. Ano ng lahi tayo? Lahi na tayo ng Diyos. 18. Nasa kadiliman ng kanilang pag-isip ay nangahiwalay sa buhay na Diyos dahil sa kahangalang nasa kanila dahil sa pagmamatigas ng kanilang puso. Nahiwalay kayo sa Diyos na buhay. Bakit? Matigas ang puso eh. 19. Na sila sa di pagkaramdam ng kahiyan ay napahikayat sa kalibugan upang kalakalin ang lahat ng karumal-dumal ng buong kasakiman. Ngunit kayo hindi nangatuto ng ganito kay Kristo. 21. Kung tunay na siya'y inyong pinakinggan at kayo'y tinuruan sa Kanya gaya ng katotohanan na kay Jesus. 22. At inyong iwan tungkol sa paraan ng inyong pamumuhay na nakaraan ang dating pagkatao. Sana yan. Inyong iwan ang dating nakaraan, yung mga dating pagkatao. Bakit iniiwan? Para mabago. Kasi yung dating pagkatao, sinasabi dito, na sumama ng sumama ayon sa mga kahalayan ng pagdaraya. Magdaraya kayo. Kaya nga, babaguhin kayo. 23. At kayo'y mga bago sa espiritu ng inyong pag-iisip. Ito na yun, mabago. 24. At kayo'y mga bihis ng bagong pagkatao na ayon sa Diyos ay nilalang sa katwiran at sa kabanalan ng katotohanan. Kaya, para mabago, lumapit kayo, ay magiging bagong pagkatao na kayo. Kasama na kayo sa nilalang sa katwiran at sa kabanalan ng katotohanan. 25. Kaya, pagkatakwil ng kasinungalingan ay magsasalita ang bawat isa sa inyo ng katotohanan sa kanyang kapwa, sapagkat tayo'y mga sangkap ng isa't isa sa atin. 26. Kayo'y nangagalit at huwag kayong magkasala, huwag lumubog ang araw sa inyong galit. Sabihin, ang galit, tapusin ka agad. para may kapayapaan sa Diyos. 27. Nibigyan daan man ang dyablo. Ito na yon. Huwag bibigyan ng panahon o pagkakataon ang dyablo. Sinasabi niyo ito, huwag bigyan daan. Yung iba, lalapit pa sa doon sa dyablo. Pupunta pa sa Quiapo. Dyablo nga yun. 28. Ang nagnanakaw ay huwag nang magnakaw. Huwag nang magnakaw pa. Bagpos, magpagal na igawa ang kanyang mga kamay ng mabuting bagay upang siya may maibigay sa nangailangan. Pero yan sa kongreso. Okay? Ito. Sapat panahon ng hatol ng Diyos ay tumakas kayo sa kamay ng dyablo. Ay sino ba yung kamay ng dyablo dito sa bansang ito? Ay si Marcos. Ha? Pumirma yan. Pinirmahan, nakita ko doon sa San Pedro, Laguna. Ay, yung notebook, makapal. May mga ID. Pinirmahan. Yung doon sa San Pedro, Laguna, ang pinuntahan ni Marcos, Union Bank. Ha? Union Bank. Ay, maraming pera yon doon sa, nasa akin ang record eh. Maraming pera yan doon sa Switzerland. Pag sinabing Union Bank, maraming depository. Ay sabi sa akin ng Diyos, nagkamatay na raw yung code number yan, may mga code number. Ay sabi sa akin ng Diyos, nagkamatay yan, nagkamatay. Ang mga pera na ginawang pera na mga ginto, ginawang perang ginto eh, tinimbang, tapos dineposit sa mga bangko, ay lumaki na ang tubo yan. Kasi mayroong ginto na 3 taon pa lang, mayroon ng porsyento eh. Ito, nakukuha na ang tubo eh, 3 taon nilagay sa bangko. Mayroon 5 taon, may 10 taon, may 15 years. Yun, malaki na yun. Ay, pinirmahan ni Marcos. Yung sinasabi dito, yung kamay mo na lumabya. Pag nanakaw yun, 29. Anumang salitang mahalay ay huwag lumabas sa iyong bibig, kundi ang mabuting katitibay ayon sa pangailangan upang makinabang ng biyaya ang mga nagsisipagkinig. Ito na yan, si Marcos hindi man nagmumura. Hindi nagmumura si Marcos, talagang kanyang masalita, maingat. Pero, hindi naman lumalapit sa Diyos. Magkaiba sila ni former President Duterte. Si former President Duterte, mahilig magsalita sa Diyos. Pero yung nagmumura naman, Ito naman si Pangulong Marcos ngayon. Hindi ko naman nagsasalita ito pa hindi bumibigkas ng Diyos. Pero hindi nagmumura. Magkaiba yung kanilang ano bang ibig sabihin niya? Bakit nang magkaiba sila? Magkalaban. Ibig sabihin, si Pangulong Duterte, hindi Katoliko, kasi minura niya ang mga Katoliko. Ay dito sa Pilipinas, maraming Katoliko. Ay si Marcos, Katoliko. Ay kung pagmumurahin niya, madadamay ang kanyang sarili. Kaya hindi siya nagmumura. Kaya magkaiba. 30. At huwag ninyong pighatiin ang Espiritu Santo ng Diyos na sa Kanya'y kayo'y tinatakan hanggang sa karawan ng pagkatubos. Ito na yan. Ito na yan. Pagkatubos na ng bansa ito. Diyos ang tutubos. Kaya nga, yung kaguluhan ito sa buong mundo, dahil tutubusin ang bansang ito, ay iingatan ng Diyos ito sa kaguluhan sa mga ligmaan. Ngunit ang Pangulo, kung hindi kumikilala sa Diyos na buhay, mapaparusahan. Ha? Mapaparusahan siya kahit iniingatan ang bansang ito ng Diyos. Pero ang Pangulo naman hindi kumikilala, may parusa. Kung, kasi, ano na eh, sa dalawang pananalitan niya, State of the Nation, dalawang klaseng signal number 5. Sa salita naman siya, pangatlong salita, ay, pangatlong baka. Ha? Diyos ang nakakaalam. Malalaman natin kung dumating naman yan. Ha? Jesus 31. Ang lahat ng kapaitan at kagalitan at pagkakaalit at kadaldalan at paglilibak ay mga alis nawa sa inyo, pati ng lahat ng masasamang akala. Kaya ito si Marcos, maingat dito eh. Maingat nito si Marcos. Ha? Kaya lang, nakikinig siya sa mga kasinungalingan. Nakikinig siya sa kasinungalingan. Kaya yung bayan nagtataka. Bakit ito si Marcos, presidente natin, dapat itong magsalita? Bakit hindi nagsasalita, tahimik? Ha? Kaya, ha? Itong sinasabi dito, kadaldalan, ingatan, tahimik talaga si Marcos. Kaya lang nakikinig sa mga sinungaling. Halos sinasabing walang panindigan ng presidente. 22. At magmagandang loob kayo sa isa't isa, mga mahabagin na mga patawaran kayo sa isa't isa, kaya naman ng pagpapatawad sa inyo ng Diyos kay Kristo. Ito na yan. Ha? Dahil nga sa ano yung drug war, ang kamatay, ay hindi. Wala. Ang ginagawa ni Marcos ngayon, kung siyang Pangulo, kapag-aaralan natin yung ICC, ay pag-aaralan daw eh. Ang nangyari, nakipag-ugnayan na pala siya. Tapos na eh. Yari na. Ibig sabihin, ang ICC nakapasok na. Ibig sabihin, kasi sinasabi, magpatawaran kayo sa isa't isa. Ibig sabihin, si Marcos, hindi pa niya pinatatawad si former President Duterte. Kaya tuloy-tuloy ang kanyang kasalanan. Ha? Tuloy-tuloy ang kasalanan kasi kung hindi patawarin, nagkakamali siya dito sa salita ng Diyos sa Efeso 3:32. Ha? Hanggang dito na lang tayo, hanggang 32 lang ang ating. Ang Efeso 4 hanggang 32, ito ang dulo, 32, na sinasabi, magpatawaran kayo sa isa't isa at maging magandang loob. Sa makatwid, como ang sabi ni former president, hindi na tayo member ng ICC. Kasi ang kapanahonan niya, inalis niya yun. Ay pagdating ni Marcos, siguro pinapasok na eh. Baka nandito na eh. Hindi ko na ano yung ano. Pero nung isang araw, nagpatugtog ako tungkol sa ICC. Baka nandito na. Kung nandito na, ha, ay hindi niya pinatatawad si former President Roa Duterte. Sa makatuwid, magkakaroon ng ano, hindi nga sila nagkakaroon ng pagkakaisa. Ang lakad ng Diyos, ha, pagbabago, paglilinis, pagkakaisa. Kaya nga, Kung hindi nga kayo magkakaisa, hindi nga kayo lalapit sa Diyos. Ha? Hindi kayo lalapit sa Diyos. Hindi kayo papahatol. Ay, anong mangyayari? Ay, ang sinasabi yun, kakilakilabot ang mahulog sa kamay ng Diyos na buhay. Yung binasa natin kanina, katibayan. Kaya hanggang dito na lang, mga kadagdig, mga kabansa ko, mga kababayan ko. Marami pong salamat, higit sa lahat, sa ating Diyos Ama, Anak, at ang Espiritu Santo, na ating dinadakilan ng mataas na pagpuri. Marami pong salamat. At sa apat na sulok na mahukbo ng Diyos na nagmamalasakit, marami pong salamat. Hanggang dito na lang sa susunod naman na panunod